This October, Russia will be hosting the 16th BRICS summit, where leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa will meet. But for the first time since 2010, these 5 namesake countries of BRICS will be joined by new members, with many others waiting in the wings.
According to the claim, now more than 40 countries are willing to join the BRICS.
Why are so many countries suddenly eager to join the bloc?
In applying to join BRICS, Malaysia aims to diversify our economic diplomacy efforts and enhance collaboration.
The idea is essentially for these economies to come together to improve their trading relationship.
And will a growing BRICS threaten the Western-led world order?
We see a lot of sovereign nations realizing that the entire international order has been unraveling before their eyes.
BRICS seen as an anti-Western coalition given China's domination.
Here, in the Bukit Jalil suburb of Kuala Lumpur, is the sprawling Meranti Park. The Malaysian Research Accelerator for Technology and Innovation is an incubation space for some of Malaysia's hottest startups.
Technology Innovation Park Malaysia, Meranti, have been working with everyone, with many of the players in the startup space, technology space, innovation space. At the same time, we also have collaborations with entities in India, for instance, in the space of agri-tech. We work in China. We have signed some collaborative agreement with Zhongguacheng, Z-Park.
These efforts are all part of Malaysia's big plans to be a global tech hub by 2030.
We want to be a technology-producing nation. How can we do that? Learning from others who have done that, been there earlier than us. When you talk about the startup space, what are the startup guys looking for? Access to market, access to capital, access to talent, access to innovation.
To take a step towards this vision, Malaysia hopes to join a group that could create a seismic shift in the international order. BRICS. What exactly is BRICS? The organization had its genesis as a catchy acronym coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs executive Jim O'Neill as a label for 4 large emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
So the original first 4 countries are actually the biggest developing country from their respective region. Originally, it was intended to be a counter-narrative to the popular grouping of advanced industrial countries like G7.
A series of informal meetings between the 4 countries' foreign ministers began in 2006, culminating in the first BRICS summit in 2009 in Russia.
And the idea is essentially for these economies to come together to improve their trading relationship, to create alternatives in order to provide the global economy with new drivers of growth away from the usual suspects in the G7 or the developed economies.
At the second BRICS summit in April 2010, leaders from South Africa and Palestine were invited to attend. South Africa became a full member in December that year, turning BRIC into BRICS. In the decade or so since, BRICS remained a quasi-formal organization. It did not have codified rules or mechanisms like the UN or WTO.
When we talk about BRICS, what I would say is just probably a loose organization, not so formal, but not so casual. They all more or less share the same objective, which is to have economic prosperity among themselves to become sustainable or more competitive.
But at last year's summit came an important development. For the first time since 2010, BRICS announced an expansion of its membership.
We have decided to invite the Argentine Republic, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to become full members of BRICS.
The original idea is that to build a kind of a developing country solidarity. So now that the membership has been expanded, so now it will become a multi-regional grouping of developing countries.
This October, when the 16th summit is held in Kazan, Russia, it will bring a new look with an expanded BRICS. Additionally, over 40 countries have expressed interest to join the group. In Southeast Asia, Thailand and Malaysia have applied for membership.
I think when Thailand expressed their intention to join, they wanted to be seen as the leading economy from Southeast Asia region to be part of this new type of a grouping among the developing countries. So I believe that Malaysia not wanting to fall behind, so would interested be part of the membership.
On September 4th this year, Russian President Vladimir Putin invited Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim to attend this year's BRICS summit as an observer.
In applying to join BRICS, Malaysia aims to diversify our economic diplomacy efforts and enhance collaboration.
For Malaysia, membership could bring a much-needed boost, especially with its tech ambitions.
Now, there are a lot of upsides to what Malaysia can benefit in terms of joining BRICS, definitely. Among them is enhanced technology sharing as well as technology acquisition. We're looking at spurring innovation, we're looking at reduction in tariffs and trade barriers, and we're also looking at stimulating investment flows from countries such as the BRICS countries today. And their studies has shown that China will essentially overtake the United States in terms of technology within the next essentially within the decade.
Just imagine the huge market that China has, the huge market that India has, the huge market that Russia has, and all those other BRICS plus now they call themselves, has. So you just expand the market, you just expand the opportunities.
The clamour to have a seat at the BRICS table is a result of the growing economic might among BRICS members.
In 2000, BRICS shares for global GDP was about 18%, and today they're looking at about 32% in 2023, while G7 countries today comprise of the global GDP in 2023 approximately 31%. So the global GDP share of BRICS countries has already exceeded the G7.
With the expansion, BRICS countries now represent about 45% of the world's population. The grouping controls over 40% of global oil production and a quarter of world trade. But beyond these numbers, what lies behind BRICS' momentum could be a growing dissatisfaction with the Western-led world order.
There is a general climate in what we call the global south. A general climate where the sense is that the global economy and the distribution of power and influence in the global economy is no longer a fair representation of reality. The question is, if you look at the economic and financial institutions that you have in the world, do they capture this diffusion of power that we have seen over the last 2 decades, 3 decades? I think the answer is no, right? You look at the current institutions, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, the dominance that the United States has, the conclusion that many countries in the global south arrive at is that we are well into the 21st century, but a lot of these institutions still represent the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, if not the 19th century. And a lot of the sentiments in the Global South, not only among leaders, but among people, populations in the Global South, are that either you change the 20th century institutions to better represent the distribution of power influence that we have in the 21st century. If not, then you have to create new institutions that better capture what the state of affairs is today.
Can BRICS embody this vision? Well, the bloc is looking to disrupt the current international order in one significant way, by dethroning the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. How would this happen, and would it shake up the global economy as we know it?
I am Munish Goel. I'm the Chief Business Development and Growth Director at Goel International Private Limited. We are primarily a basmati rice manufacturer based out of Haryana in India. I'm the third generation into the business. So this rice is majorly used to make items such as kabza and mandi in Middle East. And then in India, it is famously known for biryani. And we are currently exporting to over 40 countries, mainly across the Gulf. Currently, of all of our turnover and our manufacturing capacity, 20% of it is going to Iran.
Iran was one of the biggest markets for Indian rice. But in 2023, India's rice exports to the Middle Eastern country fell by a third. Munish's business took a hit.
From 2014, from 55% of our turnover being exported to Iran, that has dropped down to 25%.
What precipitated this decline were US sanctions on Iran. Previously, India would buy oil from Iran, paying in rupees. Iran would in turn use these rupees to purchase produce like tea and rice from India. But since 2019, India halted oil imports after the US imposed sanctions on Iran. As a result, Iran is now running out of rupees to pay for rice. Instead, transactions must be made through a third currency.
Currently, all of the transactions has been happening through euros or US dollars. A very big challenge for us is managing the currency fluctuations, because the currency in Iran fluctuates almost on a daily basis, if not monthly. That rupee mechanism was very quick and very fast. But now, because of this dollar and euro dependency, the trade has moved to more third-party partners, fourth-party partners. Earlier, the work that was getting done in 1 week, now it takes more than a month.
India and Iran are both BRICS members. As thousands of traders and businesses face similar challenges, one idea is gaining traction: de-dollarisation, reducing an economy's reliance on the US dollar.
The trend of de-dollarization didn't happen yesterday, it didn't happen last year. It happened for the last 20-25 years. It's been happening quarter of a century. But with the presence of BRICS and the presence of an alternative trade settlement system, de-dollarization actually occurred in an accelerating rate.
So, what is driving de-dollarization efforts? After World War II, the US dollar, backed by gold, became the world's reserve currency. The greenback would underpin the global economy as central banks held much of their foreign reserves in US dollars. Even after President Nixon took the dollar off the gold peg in 1971, it still retained its dominance when oil began trading in dollars. Today, about half of global trade is denominated in the currency.
To facilitate the movement of the product and services, you need medium of exchange. And at the moment, majority of the world currencies actually consisted of US dollar when you're talking about using for the trading. And it's a very powerful tool for US to control the narrative economically or politically for many countries.
But as geopolitical fault lines grew between America and some BRICS countries, the dominance of the US dollar has become a pain point, such as in the case of sanctions on Iran.
US sanctions haven't been the most constructive way of engaging global financial supremacy and centrality of US dollar.
They impose sanctions which will affect trade between Iran and other countries, because as long as we are do the transaction in US dollar, right? SWIFT mechanism will not allow for Indonesia to have payment in US dollar or any other country. Then the US will impose sanction also to Indonesia if we do something. It is not fair.
SWIFT stands for the Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications.
Essentially, SWIFT is a transactional code and program that is used between countries to settle the trade between countries as well. For example, if you have a bank in Malaysia and you have a bank in Indonesia that wants to communicate, they will essentially a common language provided by SWIFT. Most of the SWIFT transactions across the world is essentially conducted in the US dollar, right? So for any country that uses the SWIFT code, the United States, because of its power of its currency, it can instruct SWIFT to stop operating between that particular country, and therefore the country will not be able to trade in US dollar anymore, and effectively they are sanctioned.
In March 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Russian banks were crippled when they were barred from the SWIFT network by the Western powers. And when the US threatened to sanction Chinese banks for their Russian dealings, over 90% of Chinese banks had to refuse Russian transactions this August.
Countries like China, Russia, they don't want this. So this actually prompted these countries to start looking into the alternative, because they don't want to be subjected to this kind of so-called blackmail by one particular country.
Even countries that are not US adversaries are aggrieved by the greenback's supremacy. Since COVID, the US Federal Reserve has kept interest rates high. Capital flowed into the US seeking better returns, which in turn strengthened the dollar. As a result, global currencies depreciated against the greenback, driving up domestic inflation. This February, the Malaysian ringgit hit a 26-year low against the US dollar.
When you are too dependent on a foreign currency, whatever policy you plan ahead for your people, it can be simply, I would say, sabotaged by the movement of this foreign currency due to what's happening in US, due to sentiment or speculation. So because of that, any option, any feasible opportunity to reduce the impact of dollar on ringgit will be welcome. Then something like BRICS could possibly offer that kind of this alternative solution.
BRICS' solution is to reduce the reliance on the US dollar and the American-led financial system.
That's one of the things that BRICS is driving as well, trying to encourage countries to trade on their own currency instead of the US dollar.
If we are able to sort out the financial transactions, like the policies and all of the problems that our industry is currently facing, I'm pretty sure the volumes of exports from India to Iran can even further increase.
For example, last March, China and Brazil struck a deal to trade in their local currencies. Meanwhile, China and Saudi Arabia are in talks to use the renminbi for oil exports. At the end of 2023, 95% of China-Russia trade use ruble and renminbi. However, such trades depend on the stability of local currencies.
If you look at the spectrum of countries that are joining BRICS, most of the countries have quite volatile currencies, and trading in those currencies would essentially translate into more transactional costs and a little bit more volatility as well.
Confidence of traders is very important. Don't forget that if markets have no confidence, no currency can survive.
To mitigate fluctuations between local currencies, there are suggestions among BRICS members to go one step further by establishing a common currency among members. However, many observers remain skeptical of its feasibility.
I think improving bilateral trade, having more of that trade being conducted using their own currencies, I think that is perfectly doable. I think de-dollarisation in terms of significantly eroding the dominance of the US dollar, I think is going to be quite difficult.
Can you imagine they can come up easily with this currency? Which one? Renminbi? Ruble? Do you think India will accept that idea to use renminbi, for example?
My opinion is that there will be no BRICS currency. Because when there is one BRICS currency, essentially what happens is that they have to be unified in terms of either geopolitically or socially or economically, right? BRICS is very diverse, right? You've got China, you've got India, you've got South Africa, you've got Brazil. They're very, very diverse, right? So when they're diverse, it's very difficult to form one currency. Unless, of course, they can agree that that currency is pegged to something that all the nations do not have control over. For example, gold. But still, it will be a tall order for all these countries to agree on one currency.
No one is against the BRICS currency, but we need to thoroughly think through the process. What steps are required, what level of integration, how much China is open to integrate economy with others without having the dominance that China usually comes up with. We need to bring first the central banks together, credit rating agencies together, stock markets together, their integration, and then currency would be possible.
Whatever form it takes, there are signs that de-dollarisation is happening nonetheless. The US dollar's share of global foreign reserves is at its lowest level of the 21st century, an indication that countries are reducing their reliance on the greenback. When BRICS convenes in the October summit, de-dollarisation is expected to be a key agenda item.
If that succeeds, it creates major tensions in the financial market, in the trade market, and also in terms of institutional preparedness that we need at the level of Bank for International Settlements.
A few economists have already mentioned that they expect the US dollar to essentially crash within this decade and move into hyperinflation sooner or later, by this decade at least.
While countries like Malaysia and Thailand are keen to join BRICS, others are hesitant. Why? The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail system was launched in October 2023. Funded and operated in part by China, Whoosh, as the rail is known by locals, is the first of its kind in Southeast Asia.
Hampir 2-3 minggu sekali untuk naik bus ini, terutama untuk kalau kita silaturahmi ke anak-anak ada di Jakarta.
Sebelumnya sih memang pengguna kereta api yang biasa ya, sama naik travel atau bus gitu. Cuma karena sekarang udah ada bus, jadi kayak lebih efisien, terus menghemat waktu juga gitu.
Indonesia is the leading recipient of Chinese investments in Southeast Asia. China is also its largest trading partner. India, its 5th largest. It also has significant trade relations with other BRICS countries like Brazil and the UAE. These factors make Indonesia a prime candidate for BRICS membership.
Indonesia has been approached by BRICS members during that time, I think quite some time, 2014 something. but only in the recent past that they are more serious, particularly when the last BRICS summit in China, 2020 to 22, I think, then they remind Indonesia.
The reason why Indonesia has been invited to join the BRICS is because our important position in the global world. Indonesia has the fourth largest population, which means the largest market in the world, and Indonesia is very strategically located.
But ultimately, Indonesia decided to adopt a wait-and-see approach.
Untuk menjadi anggota baru dari BRICS, suatu negara harus menyampaikan surat expression of interest. Dan sampai saat ini memang Indonesia belum menyampaikan surat tersebut. Karena kita ingin mengkaji terlebih dahulu, mengkalkulasi terlebih dahulu, kita tidak ingin tergesa-gesa.
Despite the fact that Indonesia has strong relationship with China, India, or any other countries within the BRICS, so we don't need another multilateral forum to strengthen our relationship with those countries.
Why are countries like Indonesia hesitant to join BRICS? One concern is the bloc's ideological position. Though BRICS is supposed to be an apolitical economic forum, there is a growing perception that it is shaping up to be an anti-West coalition.
BRICS seen as an anti-Western coalition given China's domination in the BRICS group. Indonesia wants to be neutral, and given that the BRICS is seen as an anti-West coalition, to maintain its position as a country with free and active policy, it's one of the reasons why Indonesia decided not to join the BRICS.
Countries that are democracies cannot be seen to be engaging too cozily with totalitarian states, whether it's China or Russia.
In this era of trade wars and superpower rivalry, picking the right partners can be consequential. Indonesia is the world's largest supplier of nickel, producing about 30% of the world's supply. Much of the country's development in nickel mining was achieved through Chinese investments and partnerships.
China is one of the largest producers of electric vehicles in the world. And nickel has been one of the important sources for electric vehicle battery, EV battery. 80 to 90% of nickel industry in Indonesia is dominated by China.
But in July of this year, reports emerged that Chinese investors are looking to divest the Indonesian nickel holdings. The reason? America's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act offers rebates on electric vehicles purchases. But there's a catch. These tax breaks don't apply if EVs contain batteries and critical components from companies with over 25% Chinese ownership. So, Chinese companies began reducing their stake to fall below the threshold.
With the withdrawal of some of the Chinese companies, this will give a lot of surprise to some of the Indonesian actors in the nickel industry. Why? Because it means if they have to change to partner with other actors beyond China, they have to go through all of this procedure, and that's not easy for them.
At the same time, Jakarta must also consider its domestic audience. According to the Indonesia National Survey Project 2022, 34.1% of respondents thought that the rise of China would have a negative impact on neighboring countries like Indonesia, compared to 27.1% who perceived a positive impact.
For the past several years, Jokowi has been criticized for being too inclined to China. By not joining the BRICS, which Jokowi see now very important, Jokowi can show to the domestic audience, look, we're not that inclined to China by not joining the BRICS.
2.5 kilometers southeast of Batam Island in Indonesia lies Rempang. Last August, some 7,500 residents were instructed by the government to vacate their homes immediately to make way for a sand processing plant owned by Chinese manufacturer Sinyi Glass. Locals clashed with authorities to stop the development.
Daripada saya huru-hara terus sama pemerintah ini yang saya tidak mau juga, karena saya juga pingin hidup tenang, Pak. Tenang betul, karena sudah 1 bulan nih payah tidur saya nih mikirin kampung ini.
Investasi pembangunan itu nggak masalah, tapi janganlah semuanya dipukul rata, katanya mau diratakan, digusur semua, itu gimana coba nasib-nasib mereka itu? Atau itu berita benar atau enggak? Anak-anak sekolah di sini gimana nasib mereka?
We see that a lot of Chinese investment have negative impact on the environment, on the social life surrounding the communities, and so on and so forth. But China provides money very quickly, and another important reason is because over the past 10 years, Indonesia and China sees there is a synergy of interest.
For Indonesia, BRICS is not the only game in town. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, has courted Indonesia. The OECD grouping is primarily comprised of wealthy Western nations.
At the current situation, when the BRICS has been expanded with the other 5, then the OECD will be very anxious. That's why they also have been pushing forward their effort to persuade Indonesia to join only at the recent past.
In May, Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, Airlangga Hartarto, announced that Indonesia could be an OECD member by 2027. This, however, does not mean BRICS membership is off the table.
For me, this is the time when Indonesia not to be in a hurry to join one or the other. Bilateral cooperation with those big powers is more important than merely join the big organizations or forum.
I think there is a possibility when BRICS are no longer seen as China-centric, there is a likelihood that Indonesia will join.
As for Malaysia, Prime Minister Anwar expressed confidence that BRICS membership will not sway Malaysia's position.
We should be able to be confident enough to determine our course of action, our priorities, our strategic interests, defined on our own terms.
If Malaysia decides to join BRICS, it also has to manage the perception that it is still neutral, it still welcomes Western investment as well. And it can also, be a bridge for Western investors as well as the Eastern investors into ASEAN, leveraging on its ASEAN chairmanship.
Nonetheless, the perception that BRICS is dominated by China remains, causing some consternation within the grouping itself. Will internal tensions cause BRICS to crumble? October 7th, 2023. Hamas fighters launched a deadly attack from Gaza into Israel, killing over 1,000. Israel retaliates with airstrikes and ground offensive into Gaza. 1 year on, the war continues, leaving the territory devastated and over 40,000 dead. The conflict in Gaza has shaken up the established world order.
Since the Palestine-Gaza issue, we see a lot of sovereign nations realizing that the entire international order as well as the international law has been unraveling before their eyes. The amount of power that global powers exerted relating to ICJ, ICC, United Nations ceasefire recommendations has all been ignored, sent a clear message to the world community that the United Nations has little to no power in regulating any of these international incidences, right? So a lot of countries are applying for BRICS, not because of the attraction of BRICS as much, but it's more towards the push from the West away from the current system or the world order that we have today.
Seizing the narrative, BRICS would present an alternative to the established order.
Мы призываем объединить усилия международного сообщества, направленные на деэскалацию обстановки, прекращение огня и поиск политического разрешения Палестино-израильского конфликта. И ключевую роль в этой работе могли бы сыграть государства БРИКС и страны региона.
With over 40 countries waiting in the wings to join BRICS, as it expands, can the bloc become a credible alternative to the Western-led order?
BRICS is an important organization. It's anchored on the second largest economy and a whole bunch of major oil producers. So the sort of importance of BRICS obviously is amplified. But just because countries are together in an organization does not mean that their interests are 100% aligned with each other. You have countries there that, number one, have one foot in the sort of BRICS camp and one foot in the sort of US camp, if we want to think in terms of camps. Number two, you have many members of BRICS who are actually G20 members as well, right? And number three, you have members of BRICS who have issues with each other. So what does that mean? To me, very simple. That means that decision making in BRICS is going to be very difficult,
One question is, who will lead the BRICS? Its two largest members, both in terms of population and economy, have a long-standing rivalry.
In the case of India and China, the more there is tension between India and China, the more it will impact on the credibility of BRICS. One is the long-standing territorial dispute. The second area of conflict between India and China is China is looking at dominance in Asia and global dominance.
Even on the Belt and Road Initiative, China's global infrastructure and trade project, there is friction.
One is the Belt and Road Initiative challenges India's territorial claims. And the second is the Belt and Road Initiative is there to make China wealthy, but how is it benefited others?
I don't see any rivalry between China and India in economic and trade front. There is huge scope for India and China to work together on investment, on trade, on strengthening global value chains. India is world's fastest growing economy. China has already arrived on several fronts. So there are possibilities of cooperation between the two economies.
Here, the expansion of BRICS from BRICS to BRICS Plus could be advantageous. It could reduce the dominance of any one power and temper the bloc's anti-West image.
So by expanding BRICS, India would get in a group of new supporters who might present a consolidated counter to the Chinese agenda of dominating geopolitics in Asia Pacific.
Malaysia is comfortable to join BRICS, not fearing that it would be an anti-West coalition because of countries like India, South Africa, and those new members like Saudi Arabia, who are also close partners of the United States. And I think Turkey just expressed intention to join BRICS, and Turkey is the first NATO ally to do so. So I think it would further dilute the anti-Western coalition image that the Western Alliance thought BRICS is about.
Currently, the US has trade tensions with China, as well as sanctions on Russia. This has impacted businesses trading with these countries. In India, Hindustan Medical Devices is one of the country's largest pharmaceutical product companies.
In the COVID times, 1 of every 7 syringes used worldwide came from HMD. Over 2 billion syringes were supplied globally. We had a very good exports to Russia. Unfortunately, our distributor in Russia was bought out by an American company. And because of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the business got suspended, and we've had to face issues of regulatory approvals as well as of foreign exchange. Is definitely a challenge now to sell to Russia.
As BRICS expands, the broader slate of trading partnerships will allow businesses and countries to hedge against the trade wars.
Our exports to Russia were, I would say, suspended for some period of time because of regulatory issues and currency issues. But the other countries like South Africa or the other BRICS nations, whether in Middle East, you've got Iran, you've got Saudi Arabia, various countries we are supplying our products.
I think the current Malaysian government may see that BRICS would allow us to diversify further away from our traditional partnerships. So whoever would become the new member would provide new opportunities for Malaysia to advance further.
When the 16th BRICS Summit convenes on October 22nd, it will be the first to be attended by these new members. Many countries will be represented as observers as well. What's on the agenda will signal the bloc's future ambitions.
In terms of what they will be discussing in the coming summit, I think there's a lot more aggressive talk in terms of trade settlement systems. I think that would be one of the higher in agenda. And the other one is the currency.
As this institution develops, as they get more members, as it becomes more institutionalized, I think the agenda is likely to get broader. And so the question for BRICS is whether this is going to dilute its core purpose and objectives, or whether as an organization, as a collection of member states, they all agree that they want the agenda to expand.
Fact is that I don't see the BRICS very clear in what it wants to do. Is it just a grouping of the wealthier nations outside of EU and North America? Are there initiatives in place? Is there a common trading currency amongst BRICS countries? I don't think the BRICS, without new innovative ideas, without new initiatives, has much to give to the world.
BRICS, what can I say? By having, according to the claim, now more than 40 countries are willing to join the BRICS. Do you think then BRICS become a very solid organization? I believe BRICS will only become paper tiger.
Whatever the October summit achieves, the growing interest in BRICS has made one thing clear. There is a sea change in the established international order.
I'll be very honest and candid about this. BRICS is the future, really. The Western economies are on a decline, and if they're able to, establish a fair order, right, similar to what we have international order, but it's actually respected, then I believe a lot of countries will actually migrate to support BRICS.
The landscape is going to change. Yeah. So You're going to have countries that are, members of the UN, members of BRICS, members of the AIIB, SCO, G20, whatever, all at the same time. You got to be able to dance, chew gum, walk, juggle all at the same time. This is really how I see the global order evolving. Most countries, and they are very comfortable just seizing on whatever opportunities that are available for them to advance their own interests.